Dear Margaret, I don't know if you can hear me somehow, but I wanted you to know that I made it. Today was my first day teaching, and it was everything I'd dreamed it would be and more. The kids are wonderful, challenging, and full of surprises. I think you would have loved them. I understand now why you didn't mention me in the will. You knew your family would have fought it, and you wanted to protect me from that. But more than that, you wanted to give me something that was just between us, a secret gift that honored both me and my mother. I found out that David and Victoria sold the Queen and house within a month of the will reading. They liquidated most of the foundation's assets too, just like you predicted. You were right about them, and I'm grateful you saw fit to protect what you wanted to give me. I've decided to start a small scholarship fund with part of what you left me. I want to help other kids who have dreams of becoming teachers but might not have the means to pursue them. I'm calling it the Susan Chun Margaret Whitmore Scholarship for Future Educators. I think you and my mother would both approve. Emma Rodriguez, yes. She's Elena's granddaughter, which I discovered today reminds me so much of myself at that age. She's quiet and thoughtful, but I can see the spark in her eyes when she talks about helping others. I have a feeling she's going to be something special. Thank you for seeing me, Margaret. Thank you for seeing my mother and me. Thank you for giving me the chance to honor her memory by following in her footsteps. I promise to make you both proud. With all my love. Sarai folded the letter and placed it in the photo album Margaret had left me, next to the pictures of her and my mother. Tomorrow, I would place the wooden plaque on my desk, where I could see it every day. A reminder of the two extraordinary women who had shaped my path. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected visit during my planning period. The school secretary knocked on my classroom door with a nervous expression. Miss Chen, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about Mrs. Whitmore's estate. My heart dropped. Had David and Victoria somehow found out about the safety deposit box? Were they going to try to take back what Margaret had given me? But the man who walked into my classroom wasn't a lawyer or an investigator. He was tall and distinguished, probably in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ms. Chen, I'm Dr. Robert Martinez from the University of Washington School of Education. I was a friend of Margaret Whitmore's, and I've been hearing wonderful things about you. I've been assertive in conversation, relaxed slightly. Nice to meet you, Dr. Martinez. How did you know Margaret? She was on our advisory board for 20 years, always passionate about supporting new teachers, especially those who showed real promise. He looked around my classroom, taking in the vibrant displays and learning centers. She told me about you months before she passed. Said you were going to be something special. She was very kind to me. Margaret wasn't kind without reason. She had a gift for spotting exceptional teachers before they even knew they were exceptional. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. I have a proposition. For you? He explained that the university was starting a new program, a master's degree designed specifically for teachers who wanted to specialize in serving underprivileged students. It was a 2-year program that I could complete while still teaching, with classes on evenings and weekends. We'd like to offer you a full scholarship, he said. Margaret established a fund for this exact purpose before she died. She specifically requested that we seek out teachers who understood what it meant to overcome obstacles. I stared at the application packet, hardly believing what I was hearing. She planned this too. Margaret was always thinking 3 steps ahead. She believed that good teachers deserved every opportunity to become great teachers. He smiled. She also mentioned that your mother had been working on a master's degree when she died. She thought you might want to finish what your mother started. In a way, that evening, I called my grandmother in Portland. The first time we'd spoken in months, I told her about my new job, about Margaret's gift, about the scholarship opportunity. Sarah, she said softly, I need to tell you something about your mother. My heart raced. What is it, Grandma? Before she died, she was working with a woman named Margaret Whitmore on some kind of education project. She used to talk about this brilliant businesswoman who really understood what teachers needed. She was so excited about their collaboration. You knew about Margaret? Taya knew the name. After your mother died, I was so consumed with grief and getting you settled that I never followed up. But Susan talked about her all the time, said she was going to change how society supported teachers. I sank into my chair, overwhelmed. Margaret watched over me for 15 years. Grandma, she made sure I could become a teacher, just like Mom wanted. Your mother would be so proud, my grandmother whispered. She always said you had her heart for teaching. 2 months into the school year, I was staying late to grade papers when I heard a soft knock on my classroom door. Emma stood in the doorway looking uncertain. Ms. Chen, my abuela is here to pick me up, but I wanted to ask you something first. Of course, Emma, what's on your mind? Do you really think I could be a teacher someday? Not just because I'm nice, but because I'm smart enough? I set down my pen and gave her my full attention. Emma, do you know what makes someone a good teacher? She shook her head. It's not just being smart, though that helps. It's caring about other people. It's wanting to help them learn and grow. It's being patient when someone doesn't understand something the first time. I smiled at her. You have all of those qualities already, but I'm not the smartest kid in class. Neither was I, but you know what I was? I was curious. I was kind. I paid attention to how other people felt. Those are the things that matter most. Alina appeared in the doorway, smiling at our conversation. There you are, Mia, ready to go home. Abuela Ms. Chen says I could really be a teacher. Elena's eyes met mine over Emma's head. Miss Chen is very wise, just like another teacher I once knew. As they left, Alina paused at the door. Sarah, Mrs. Whitmore would be so happy to see you with Emma. She always said teachers find their students, and students find their teachers, exactly when they're supposed to. 6 months later, the Susan Chun Margaret Whitmore Scholarship awarded its first grant to a young man from Tacoma who dreamed of teaching high school science. At the small ceremony I organized, I read a letter from my mother's former principal, who remembered both Susan and Margaret fondly. They were an extraordinary team, she wrote. Susan brought the passion and expertise, Margaret brought the resources and vision. Together they proved that when you combine a teacher's heart with the means to make change happen, you can transform lives. I looked out at the small audience, Alina and Emma, Dr. Martinez, a few fellow teachers, and the scholarship recipient with his proud family. It wasn't a grand event, but it felt perfect. Margaret would have preferred it this way, focused on the purpose, not the fanfare. That night, I sat in my apartment and wrote in the journal I'd started keeping since Margaret's death. Today we gave away the first scholarship. Miguel wants to teach chemistry because his high school teacher changed his life. He reminds me of myself a year ago, full of dreams but worried about how to pay for them. Emma is thriving in school. She's made friends and joined the student council. Yesterday she told me she wants to start a tutoring program for younger kids. I think she's going to be an amazing teacher someday. The master's program is challenging but incredible. I'm learning so much about educational psychology and working with diverse populations. Margaret knew exactly what I needed. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. A year ago, I was serving coffee and dreaming about maybe, someday, possibly becoming a teacher. Now I have my own classroom. I'm working on my master's degree, and I'm helping other people achieve their dreams too. I think about Margaret and my mother every day. I feel them with me when I'm teaching, when I'm planning lessons, when I'm staying late to help a struggling student. They're part of every success, every breakthrough, every moment when I see a child's face light up with understanding. The best part is, this is just the beginning. Outside, the Seattle rain had started again, but for the first time in years, I found the sound comforting rather than melancholy. It reminded me of that day in the lawyer's office, when I'd thought I'd been forgotten, only to discover that I'd been remembered in the most beautiful way possible. Margaret had been right. The best gifts aren't the ones we expect. They're the ones that come from love, from understanding, from seeing who we really are and who we have the potential to become. As I got ready for bed, I touched my mother's necklace one more time. Tomorrow, I would wear it to school again, carrying both women with me as I worked to inspire the next generation of dreamers and changemakers. The envelope Margaret had left me had contained more than money and jewelry. It had contained a future, a connection to my past, and most importantly, the knowledge that I had been truly seen and loved by someone who understood exactly what I needed to become the person I was meant to be. In the end, that was worth more than any inheritance mentioned in a will. It was worth everything. The end. Of course. Do you have your key and identification? I showed him both, and he directed me to a teller window. The woman behind the glass was middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like someone's favorite aunt. Safety deposit box access, she said, reading from my paperwork. Box number 247. The number felt significant somehow, though I couldn't say why. She typed something into her computer, then looked up with a smile. You're Sarah Chen, owner of the box. Yes, that's right. Perfect. I'll need you to sign here, and I'll need to verify your signature against our records. She led me through a series of security doors to a room lined with small metal boxers. The walls were covered with what looked like hundreds of little metal doors, each with a number and 2 keyholes. You'll need to sign in here first, she said, pointing to a logbook, and I'll need to see your ID one more time. I flipped through the logbook entries, looking for any clue about what I might find. There it was, Margaret's signature from 6 months ago, when she'd added me to the account. The handwriting was shakier than in her letter, and I realized she must have been sicker than she'd let on. There were several other entries from her over the years, always alone, always signed with the same careful script. The most recent entry was from just 3 weeks before her death. My heart clenched, seeing her handwriting one more time, knowing it was probably the last time she'd ever written her name. The teller compared my ID to the signature card on file. Everything looks good, Ms. Chen. Box 247 is right over here. She led me to a box that was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a shoebox. It took both keys, mine and the bank's, to open it. The teller helped me remove it from the wall and placed it on a table in a small private room. Take as much time as you need, she said kindly. Just press the button when you're ready to put it back. I sat alone in the windowless room, staring at the metal box. My hands were trembling as I reached for the lid. This was it, the moment when I'd find out if Margaret's letter was real, if this incredible gift was actually mine. When I finally lifted the lid, I gasped. The box was meticulously organized, just like Margaret herself. There were neat stacks of bearer bonds held together with rubber bands, more cash than I'd ever seen in one place, and a small velvet jewelry box that looked like it belonged in a museum. Everything was labeled with small white tags in Margaret, careful handwriting. For Sarah's education, read one tag attached to a stack of bonds. For a good start, read another on an envelope full of cash. From grandmother's collection, was written on the jewelry box. But what caught my attention first was the photo album Margaret had mentioned, sitting right on top of everything else. It was bound in deep blue leather with gold edges, the kind of album that was meant to preserve important memories. I opened it with trembling fingers. The first page took my breath away. It was a photo of Margaret, probably 20 years younger, standing next to a young woman in a classroom. The woman was about my age, with long dark hair and a warm smile. She was holding a Teacher of the Year award, and Margaret had her arm around her shoulders. Both women looked radiantly happy. I turned the page, and there were more photos. Margaret and the same woman at what looked like a school fundraiser. The woman presenting at what appeared to be an educational conference, with Margaret in the audience applauding. More photos of school events, always with Margaret in the background, supporting from the sidelines. As I continued through the album, I began to notice something. The woman in the photos looked familiar, not just generically familiar, but, specifically, intimately familiar. She had my eyes, my smile, my way of tilting her head when she was thinking. It wasn't until I reached the final pages that I understood completely. The last photo was a newspaper clipping from the Seattle Times. Dated 15 years ago, the headline read, "Local teacher dies in car accident, leaves behind daughter." Below it was a photo of a young woman who looked remarkably like me, the same dark hair, the same slight build, the same serious expression I wore in my own school. Photos. Susan Chen. My mother. My hands shook as I read the article. My mother had been a teacher at Roosevelt High School, known for her innovative approach to science, education, and her dedication to underprivileged students. She'd developed a program that brought hands-on science experiments to schools that couldn't afford proper lab equipment. She'd died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening, driving home from a parent-teacher conference. I'd been 13 when she died, and I'd gone to live with my grandmother in Portland. I'd always known my mother was special, but I'd never understood the full extent of her impact on the Seattle education community. But there it was in black and white. Margaret had been one of the major donors to my mother's science program. They'd worked together for years, with Margaret providing funding and my mother providing the vision and expertise. The article mentioned that Margaret had established a scholarship fund in my mother's name after her death. I turned to the final page of the album, and there was a letter addressed to me, but dated 3 years ago, long before I'd ever met Margaret. "Sarah, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to tell you this, but I knew your mother. She was an extraordinary woman and an even more extraordinary teacher. When I heard about her death, I tried to find you, but your grandmother had moved you to Portland, and I respected that decision. A child needs stability after such a loss, not interference from strangers. Your mother used to talk about you all the time, how proud she was of your grades, your kindness, your dreams of following in her footsteps. She had a photo of you on her desk, you at your 8th grade graduation, looking so serious and determined. She would light up whenever she mentioned you. When you walked into my coffee shop 2 years ago, I knew immediately who you were. You have her eyes, her way of listening, her gift for making people feel seen and understood. I wanted to tell you, then, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I was some crazy old woman trying to replace what you'd lost. But I watched you, Sarah. I watched you treat every customer with kindness, even the difficult ones. I watched you save your tips in a jar labeled Teacher Fund. I watched you light up when you talked about working with kids, about making a difference in their lives. Your mother would have been so proud of the woman you've become. She would. I have loved knowing that her daughter inherited not just her dreams, but her heart. I hope someday I'll find the courage to tell you all of this in person. But if I don't, know that helping you isn't charity, it's honoring the memory of someone who meant the world to me, someone who showed me what it really means to make a difference. With love and admiration, Margaret. The photo album slipped from my hands as I sobbed. Margaret hadn't just been a kind customer, she'd been my mother's friend, her partner in trying to make education better for kids who needed it most. She'd been watching over me for years, waiting for the right moment to step back into my life. I thought about all our conversations, how she'd always seemed so interested in my plans to become a teacher, how she'd light up when I talked about working with kids. She'd been seeing my mother in me, and I'd never had any idea. The bearer bonds and cash suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't just a generous gift from a wealthy woman, it was a promise kept to my mother, a way of ensuring that her daughter could follow the same path of making a difference in children's lives. I wiped my eyes and looked at the contents of the box again. There was enough money to pay for my teaching degree, to get a decent apartment, to start fresh without the crushing weight of student loans. Margaret had calculated exactly what I'd need, not too much, not too little, but enough to have choices. At the bottom of the box, I found one final item, a small wooden box with a note attached. The note simply said, "This was your mother's." She gave it to me for safekeeping, hoping that someday I could give it to you. My hands trembled as I opened the wooden box. Inside was a simple gold necklace with a small pendant in the shape of an apple, the universal symbol of teachers. I remembered my mother wearing it, though I had forgotten about it until this moment. She'd worn it to every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every important day in her teaching career. I fastened the necklace around my neck, feeling the weight of it against my chest. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt like I wasn't alone in the world. Margaret had given me more than money. She'd given me a connection to my mother, a bridge between my past and my future. As I carefully packed everything back into the box, I noticed one final envelope I'd missed. It was addressed to me in Margaret's handwriting, but it was sealed with wax, clearly something she'd wanted to keep private until this moment. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. Sarah. Chapter 2. The letters revelation. I didn't open the envelope until I was back in my tiny Capitol Hill apartment, sitting on my second-hand couch with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The rain had followed me home from the lawyer's office, creating a steady rhythm against my single window that overlooked the alley behind the building. My apartment was a studio, barely 400 square feet of cramped but clean space that it decorated with thrift store finds and plants I'd managed to keep alive. The rent was still too high for my barista salary, but it was home, or at least it was all I could afford. I set the envelope on my coffee table, a wooden crate I'd found at a garage sale and painted white, and stared at it for a long time. Margaret's handwriting looked elegant even on a simple envelope, nothing like my own hurried scrawl. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened it. The envelope contained two items, a folded letter, and a small, ornate key that looked like it belonged to something old and important. The key was brass, with an intricate design that reminded me of Victorian jewelry. It was attached to a small tag with a number 247. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter, recognizing Margaret's careful script immediately. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably confused about why you weren't mentioned in the will. Please don't think for a moment that it was because you didn't matter to me. Quite the opposite, actually. You see, dear, I've been watching my family for years, and I know exactly what they would do with an inheritance left to someone outside their circle. David means well, but he's weak when it comes to Victoria. She's been waiting for me to die so she could get her hands on the family money. I've seen the way she looks at the house, the jewelry, the art collection. They would have contested anything I left you, tied it up in courts for years, and made your life miserable in the process. They would have questioned your motives, suggested you'd manipulated me, maybe even hired investigators to dig into your background. I couldn't bear the thought of putting you through that, but I'm not as helpless as they think. 25 years ago, when I first started making real money from my software company, I set up a private safety deposit box. Over the years I've been quietly moving assets there, not enough to be missed from the main accounts, but enough to matter. Bearer bonds, some cash, and a few pieces of jewelry that belonged to my mother. The key in this envelope opens box 247 at First National Bank on Pine Street. The account is in both our names, has been for 6 months now. I added you as a co-owner after I was diagnosed with a heart condition I never told anyone about. The doctors said I had maybe a year, 2, at most. That's when I started planning this. I know you're probably thinking this is too much, that you can't accept it. But Sarah, you gave me something my own family never did, genuine friendship without expectation. You listened to my stories about the old days, laughed at my terrible jokes about technology, and never once asked me for anything. You saw Margaret the person, not Margaret the wealthy widow. Do you remember that Tuesday in August when you told me about wanting to become a teacher? How your face lit up when you talked about working with kids, about making a difference in their lives. You said you'd been saving money for school, but it was going slowly because rent was so high, and student loans were so scary. I went home that day and cried. Not from sadness, but from joy. I had finally found someone who understood what it meant to want to help others, to make the world a little better. Someone who reminded me of why I had started my foundation in the first place. Use this gift to follow your dreams. Sarah, become the teacher you've always wanted to be. Make a difference in children's lives the way you made a difference in mine. There's enough there to pay for your education and give you a good start. Not millions, I'm not trying to make you wealthy, but enough to give you choices, to let you pursue your passion without the crushing weight of debt. I have one request. Don't tell David or Victoria about this. They wouldn't understand, and they don't need to. Let them think they got everything. This is between us, just like our friendship always was. Thank you for being the daughter I never had. Thank you for seeing me when so many others only saw dollar signs. Thank you for every Tuesday morning conversation, every smile, every moment of genuine human connection. With all my love and hopes for your future, Margaret's. There's something else in the box, a photo album. I think you'll understand when you see it. And Sarah, your mother would be so proud of who you've become. Read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Margaret had known about my mother. How was that possible? I'd mentioned her a few times in passing, but never in detail. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion against the window, But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. The woman I'd known as a quiet coffee customer had been secretly planning my future for months, while I'd been serving her dark roast and chatting about my dreams of teaching. She'd been ensuring I'd have the chance to achieve them. I looked at the key again, its weight somehow heavier now that I understood its significance. Part of me wanted to rush to the bank immediately, but another part was terrified. What if this was all some elaborate dream? What if I got there and the box was empty? Or worse, never existed at all? But Margaret's words echoed in my mind. You saw Margaret the person, not Margaret the wealthy widow. That was true. I'd never known about the money, the foundation, the millions. I'd known Margaret as the quiet woman who always asked about my day, who remembered the names of my difficult customers, who once brought me homemade cookies when I mentioned I was working a double shift. I thought about our conversations. All those Tuesday mornings when she'd sit at the corner table with her dark roast and we'd talk about everything and nothing. She'd tell me stories about the early days of Seattle's tech boom, about learning to code when women in programming were rare. I'd talk about my dreams, my fears, my hope that someday I could make a difference in kids' lives the way my mother had. My mother, Margaret, had mentioned her in the postscript. How could she possibly have known anything about my mother? The rain outside began to lighten, and I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would go to the bank. Tonight, I would simply sit with the magnitude of what had just happened. As I refolded the letter carefully, I noticed something I'd missed before. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, was a final note. Remember, Sarah, the best gifts aren't the ones we expect. They're the ones that come from understanding, from seeing who someone truly is and who they have the potential to become. You saw me. Now let me help you see yourself. I held the key up to the light, watching it catch the glow from my desk lamp. Whatever was in that safety deposit box, it represented more than money. It represented faith, Margaret's faith in me, in my dreams, in my future. For the first time since her death, I felt like Margaret was still with me, still believing in the scared barista who wanted to change the world one classroom at a time. Chapter 3. The discovery. The next morning dawned, clear and crisp, the kind of October day that made Seattle look like it belonged in a postcard. I'd barely slept, Margaret's letter playing on repeat in my mind, but I felt more awake than I had in weeks. There was something electric about the possibility ahead of me, something that made every color seem brighter, every sound more vivid. I dressed carefully in my best blouse and the black skirt I'd worn to job interviews, wanting to look respectable when I went to the bank. The key felt warm in my palm as I walked downtown, past the familiar storefronts and coffee shops that made up my small world. First National Bank on Pine Street was one of those old-fashioned institutions that seemed to have been there forever, all marble columns and brass fixtures. I'd walked past it hundreds of times on my way to work, but never had reason to go inside. Now, with the key clutched in my sweaty palm, I felt like I was entering a different world entirely. The interior was impressive, high ceilings polished, floors, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that spoke of serious money and important transactions. I approached the information desk, where a young man in a crisp suit looked up expectantly. I need to access a safety deposit box, I said, hoping. My voice sounded more confident than I felt. Chapter 1. The unexpected invitation. The October rain drummed against the windows of Hartwell & Associates as I sat in the mahogany-paneled waiting room, my palms sweating despite the autumn chill. The brass nameplate on the receptionist's desk caught the dim light from the overcast Seattle sky, and I couldn't help but wonder why I was here at all. I'd received the call 3 days after Margaret's funeral. A crisp, professional voice had informed me that my presence was requested at the reading of Margaret Whitmore's will. When I'd asked why, the voice had simply said, "Mrs. Whitmore specifically requested your attendance." Now, sitting in this opulent office that probably cost more to decorate than I made in a year, I felt completely out of place. My black dress was nice enough. I'd bought it at Nordstrom Rack for job interviews, but it felt shabby compared to the expensive suits and designer handbags around me. Sarah Chen. The receptionist's voice cut through my nervous thoughts. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair perfectly styled and a smile that seemed practiced. "Mr. Hartwell will see you now." I smoothed my dress and followed her down a corridor lined with oil paintings of stern-faced lawyers from decades past. The carpet beneath my feet was so thick it seemed to absorb sound, creating an almost church-like atmosphere. The funeral had been a blur of condolences and casseroles, but this felt different, more final, somehow. Mr. Hartwell's office was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer handling the estate of Seattle's wealthiest tech entrepreneur. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Elliott Bay, bookshelves lined with leather-bound legal tomes, and a massive desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark wood. The man himself was silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of measured smile that revealed nothing. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair arranged in a semicircle with several others. "We'll begin in just a moment." I glanced around the room at the other attendees. David Whitmore sat stiffly in his chair, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something I couldn't quite read. At 45, he had his mother's sharp intelligence, but none of her warmth. His wife, Victoria, perched beside him like a perfectly groomed bird of prey, her designer handbag clutched in her manicured hands. I'd met them both at the funeral, where they'd acknowledged me with polite nods before turning back to more important conversations. In the corner sat Mrs. Rodriguez, Margaret's longtime housekeeper, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She'd been with the family for over 20 years, and her grief seemed genuine, unlike the carefully composed expressions of the others. There were a few other people I didn't recognize, a woman in her 60s who looked like she might be a longtime friend, a man in an expensive suit who had lawyer written all over him, and a younger woman who kept checking her phone. And then there was me, Sarah Chen, the 28-year-old barista who'd somehow ended up in this room full of people who actually mattered, to Margaret Whitmore. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Hartwell began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "As you know, we're here for the reading of Margaret Whitmore's last will and testament. Mrs. Whitmore was very specific about who should be present for this reading." He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick document. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a private proceeding. The contents of this will are confidential. I'd met Margaret 2 years ago at Grind Coffee, the small shop where I worked near Pike Place Market. She was different from our usual customers, quieter, more observant. She'd order the same thing every Tuesday, a medium dark roast with a splash of cream, no sugar. We'd talk about books, the weather, sometimes about my dreams of becoming a teacher. You know," she'd said one particularly rainy Tuesday, "I never had children of my own. Well, not biologically, but I've always believed that we can choose our family." I'd smiled at that, thinking she was just being philosophical. She never mentioned being worth $40 million. Never mentioned the software company she'd built from nothing, or the foundation she'd established, or the fact that her name was on a building at the University of Washington. "The bulk of the estate," Mr. Hartwell continued, his voice cutting through my memories, including the family home on Queen Anne Hill, valued at approximately $8 million, the vacation property in the San Juan Islands, and the primary stock portfolio, will be divided between David Whitmore and the Margaret Whitmore Foundation for Educational Excellence. David's shoulders visibly relaxed. Victoria's grip on her handbag loosened slightly, and I caught the ghost of a smile on her perfectly glossed lips. "To Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, for 20 years of faithful service and genuine friendship, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my grandmother's pearl necklace, which she always admired." Mrs. Rodriguez let out a soft sob, pressing the tissue to her face. "She was so good to me," she whispered, "so good to all of us." "To my dear friend Patricia Hawthorne," Mr. Hartwell continued, nodding to the older woman I didn't recognize, "I leave my collection of first edition novels and the sum of $25,000. The woman smiled through her tears. She knew how much I loved those books. Mr. Hartwell continued reading through smaller bequests, jewelry to various friends, donations to charities, specific items to people whose names meant nothing to me, a painting to her former business partner, a vintage car to her gardener, $5,000 to the animal shelter where she'd volunteered. My name wasn't mentioned once. The rain outside seemed to grow heavier, matching the sinking feeling in my chest. Why had I been invited? Had there been some mistake? Maybe the lawyer had confused me with someone else, some other Sarah who'd actually mattered to Margaret. As the reading continued, I found myself sinking lower in my chair. David and Victoria were whispering quietly to each other, probably discussing their plans for the inheritance. Mrs. Rodriguez continued to cry softly, but they were tears of grief mixed with gratitude. I felt like an imposter, a fraud who'd somehow talked her way into a private family moment. The expensive office seemed to press in around me, making me acutely aware of my second-hand dress and discount shoes. "There are also several charitable bequests," Mr. Hartwell continued. $100,000 to the Seattle Public Library System, $50,000 to the food bank, where Mrs. Whitmore volunteered, $25,000 to the Children's Hospital. Margaret had volunteered at a food bank. I'd never known that. In all our conversations, she'd never mentioned her charitable work, her wealth, or any of the things that apparently defined her life. She'd just been Margaret, the woman who remembered that I preferred working the morning shift, who asked about my grandmother's health, who once brought me soup when I mentioned having a cold. And finally, Mr. Hartwell said, to the staff at Grind Coffee, where Mrs. Whitmore spent many happy hours, a sum of $5,000 to be divided among the employees. My heart jumped. At least I'd get something, maybe a few $100. It wasn't much, but it was acknowledgement that I'd existed in Margaret's world, however briefly. "And that concludes the reading of the will," Mr. Hartwell announced. Closing the leather-bound document with a soft thud, the room began to stir. David stood up, already reaching for his phone. "I'll need to speak with you about the probate process," he said to the lawyer. "Of course," Mr. Hartwell replied. "We can schedule a meeting for next week." Victoria gathered her things with practiced efficiency, checking her reflection in her phone's camera. "David, we need to call the realtor about the Queen Anne house. The market's good right now." Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes one final time and slowly stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell." Mrs. Whitmore was very generous. She was indeed, he agreed. She spoke of you often, Elena. You were like family to her. Others began filing out, murmuring condolences and making plans. I remained seated, confused and embarrassed. Had I misunderstood the invitation? Was I supposed to leave now? Mr. Hartwell's voice stopped me as I started to rise. Could you please remain for a moment? David paused in the doorway, frowning. Is there something else? Just some paperwork to finish up, Mr. Hartwell said smoothly. Nothing that concerns the estate. Victoria tugged at David's arm. Come on, we have that appointment with the accountant. They left, Victoria's heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Mrs. Rodriguez gave me a puzzled look but followed them out. Soon, it was just me and Mr. Hartwell in the suddenly tuck-quiet room. The lawyer walked to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a cream-colored envelope. My name was written across it in Margaret's distinctive handwriting, the same careful, the script I'd seen on the thank-you notes she'd occasionally left with her tip. Mrs. Whitmore left specific instructions that this was to be given to you privately. After the formal reading, he said, sliding the envelope across the polished surface. She was quite insistent about that. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The envelope was heavier than expected, and I could feel something small and hard inside, along with what felt like folded papers. She also wanted me to tell you, Mr. Hartwell continued, his professional demeanor softening slightly, that she considered you the daughter she never had. She said you saw her for who she really was, not what she owned. I stared at the envelope, my vision blurring with tears. I don't understand.